The North Sea doesn't warn you. It doesn't build up to it. 1 second you're inside the hiss and hum of a pressurized saturation system, the low mechanical breathing of a world engineered to keep you alive. And the next second, the rule that was supposed to be unbreakable breaks. It's November 5th, 1983. The Byford Dolphin drilling rig sits 54 meters above the seabed in the Frigg gas field, straddling the border between Norwegian and British waters. The wind is 18 knots. The water temperature is 4 degrees Celsius. And inside a sealed steel chamber no larger than a freight elevator, where the most experienced saturation divers in the world are finishing what should have been a routine deep-sea shift. They have no idea that in less than 90 seconds, one man will make a single catastrophic decision. And the laws of physics, the same laws that govern every pressurized system ever built, will collect their debt in the most violent way imaginable. But here's what none of the official reports ever told you. The warning sign had been there for hours, and somebody saw it. To understand what happened on the Byford Dolphin, you need to understand what saturation diving actually is, because it's not diving in any way the word implies. It's incarceration, voluntary, highly paid, and extraordinarily dangerous incarceration. When divers work at extreme depths, the nitrogen and helium in their breathing gas dissolve into their blood and tissue under pressure. Surface too fast, and those gases expand inside your body like a shaken carbonated drink. The result, decompression sickness, ranges from crippling joint pain to paralysis to death. The deeper you go, the longer the decompression process takes. At the depths the Byford Dolphin team was working, around 100 meters, coming back to surface pressure safely could take days. Saturation diving solves this problem with brutal efficiency. You don't decompress between dives. Instead, the divers live inside a pressurized habitat on the surface. Their bodies held in a constant state of saturation that matches the depth they're working at. They sleep, eat, and breathe inside a steel chamber that maintains the equivalent atmospheric pressure of the deep. When it's time to dive, they transfer through a connecting trunk into a diving bell, a second pressurized vessel, which lowers them to work site. When they return, the bell reattaches to the habitat. The pressures equalize, and the divers crawl back inside. The connection point between the bell and the habitat, a narrow, circular trunk sealed by a single clamp mechanism, is the most critical component in the entire system. It is the threshold between controlled survival and instant annihilation. The rule governing that clamp is not a guideline. It is not a recommendation. It is a singular non-negotiable protocol of saturation diving. The clamp does not open until full pressure equalization is confirmed, not partially confirmed, not assumed, confirmed. On the evening of November 5th, 1983, that rule was ignored. The 4 divers inside the saturation habitat that night were Roy Lucas, Bjorn Jæver-Bergersen, Troels Hellevik, and William Crammond. All experienced, all certified. Lucas and Bergersen had been in saturation for several days, working in the Frigg gas field on routine maintenance tasks. Hellevik and Crammond had just completed a diving excursion and returned to the bell. The bell, with Hellevik and Crammond inside, had been successfully recovered to the surface and made it against the habitat. Standard procedure. The dive tender on duty, a man named Martin Saunders, was responsible for managing the final phase of the operation, confirming pressure equalization across the trunk, then opening the clamp to allow the divers to transfer from the bell back into the habitat. What the official Norwegian investigation would later describe as a procedural deviation, a phrase so clinical it borders on obscene, began with a single fatal misread. The pressure gauges on the system showed equalization. But here's what investigators would spend years trying to establish. Did they actually show equalization, or did someone read them incorrectly in the dim mechanical light of a North Sea rig? Because the difference between those two realities is everything. One is a system failure. The other is a human being looking at a gauge, seeing what they expect to see, and acting on an assumption that would kill 5 people. Saunders opened the clamp. The diving bell was still pressurized at 9 atmospheres, 9 times the pressure of the surface world. And the moment that clamp released, the atmosphere inside the bell didn't leak out. It detonated. What happens to a human body in a 9-atmosphere explosive decompression event is not something I will describe in detail. I'll tell you this much because the physics matters to understanding the magnitude of what occurred. At 9 atmospheres, every gas dissolved in the blood and tissue of the human body, and every hollow space inside it expands to 9 times the compressed volume in a fraction of a second. The diving bell itself became a cannon. The hatch cover, a solid steel disc, was blasted off the trunk and struck William Crammond, killing him instantly. The pressure wave that followed was not a wave in any gentle sense. It was a wall of force moving faster than human perception can process. Troels Hellevick, who was positioned directly in the trunk, the connecting passage between the bell and the habitat, bore the full force of the pressure differential. What the investigation described as a direct path of the escaping gas obliterated him. His body was found 30 feet from the rig. Inside the habitat, the sudden catastrophic depressurization, the chamber going from 9 atmospheres to surface pressure in milliseconds, killed Roy Lucas, Bjorn Yaver-Bergersen, and the dive tender Martin Saunders. Their deaths were instantaneous. Their bodies showed evidence of the most severe decompression trauma ever documented in a human being, a category of injury that forensic pathologists had no established language for because nothing like this had ever happened before. 5 men, dead in less than a second, and the rig, the Byford Dolphin, kept operating. The North Sea didn't care. The gas field didn't care. The machinery hummed on. Now here's where the official investigation ends and the real investigation begins. Because if you read the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate's report from 1984, you get a clean, manageable narrative. Procedural deviation, inadequate supervision, a single point of human error. A tragedy, yes, but a containable one. A story with a clear villain and a clear lesson. But there are details in that report, buried in appendices, scattered across technical annexes, that don't fit the clean narrative, and similar to what we uncovered in our investigation of the Ocean Ranger disaster, where official reports quietly sideline systemic warnings that had been raised months before the accident. The Byford Dolphin case contains a paper trail that suggests this was not a single moment of human error. It was a terminus of a system that had been drifting toward catastrophe for a very long time. Start with the clamp mechanism itself. The design of the bell-to-habitat connection on the Byford Dolphin used what engineers call a split clamp, a 2-piece collar that locks the trunk connection in place. Unlike later systems that incorporated redundant pressure interlock mechanisms, physical barriers that literally prevent the clamp from opening unless equalization is confirmed, the Byford Dolphin system relied entirely on human procedure, on a person following the steps, on a person reading a gauge correctly, on a person not making a mistake. In pressurized environments where a single error costs 5 lives, building your entire safety margin around human reliability is not engineering, it's hope. The question that never received a satisfactory answer in the official investigation: who, specifically, had responsibility for confirming equalization? The chain of command on a saturation diving system involves the dive supervisor, the dive tender, and the topside control team. In the chaos of a multi-day saturation operation on a working oil rig, those lines of responsibility can blur. And when they blur, you get a situation where everyone assumes someone else has confirmed the critical step. There's a term for this in aviation accident analysis, a discipline that, as we've covered in past episodes, has spent 50 years systematically cataloging the ways human beings fail in high-stakes environments. The term is normalization of deviance. It describes a gradual process by which a team begins to treat shortcuts and procedural variations as normal, because they've done it before and nothing went wrong, until the day something does. Had the confirmation step been abbreviated before November 5th? Had the process of opening that clamp become so routine, so second nature, that the formal verification had been quietly compressed into a glance, a nod, an assumption? The investigation never definitively answered that question, but it asked it in the appendices, in language careful enough to avoid assigning direct blame, while being precise enough that anyone reading closely would understand exactly what it was suggesting. But there's one more layer here, and this is the part that stayed with me since I first read the forensic pathology reports from this case. The part that recontextualizes everything. The autopsies of the 4 men who died inside the habitat. Lucas, Bergerson, Cramen, and Saunders produced findings consistent with instantaneous death from explosive decompression. Standard, if that word can apply to anything in this context. But the pathologists noted something unusual in the tissue analysis, something that, in the medical literature of the 1980s, had no clear precedent. The degree of gas embolization, the formation of gas bubbles in the blood and tissue, was so extreme that it suggested the men had not simply been killed by the pressure change. The pressure change had, in the language of the pathologist's report, rendered the human body chemically incompatible with survival at any pressure. This is not the language of a freak accident. This is a language of a system operating at the absolute edge of what the human body can withstand, and then being pushed past that edge without any warning, any transition, any mercy. These men were living at 9 atmospheres. Their entire physiology, the dissolved gases in their blood, the gas held in their sinuses and lungs and joints, had adapted to that pressure over days. Their bodies had recalibrated, and in less than a second, without preparation, without protocol, that pressure was gone. The physics didn't care that they were experienced. The physics didn't care that they had families. The physics executed its rules with perfect, indifferent precision because someone had broken the one rule designed to keep the physics in check. In the years following the Byford Dolphin Incident, the offshore diving industry underwent some of the most significant safety reforms in its history. Norway, which had already developed some of the strictest petroleum regulations in the world following the Alexander Keel Land disaster 3 years earlier, commissioned a full review of saturation diving protocols across all North Sea operations. The split clamp design that had been used on the Byford Dolphin was phased out across the industry in favor of systems with integrated pressure interlocks, mechanical barriers that make it physically impossible to open the trunk connection unless the pressure differential has been verified by the system itself, not just by a human being reading a gauge. This is the engineering principle that aviation had already discovered 30 years earlier and embedded into flight deck design. Don't build a system where human error can create a catastrophic failure. Build the system so the error cannot be made. It took 5 deaths to teach the offshore industry a lesson that aviation had already learned. That is a rhythm of industrial disaster, and it is a rhythm we have documented across this channel since the beginning, from the Piper Alpha fire, where a permit-to-work system was circumvented at a cost of 167 lives, to the Space Shuttle Challenger, where engineers raised alarms about O-ring performance in cold temperatures and were overruled by a launch schedule. The shape of these disasters is always the same. A rule exists. The rule was created because something terrible happened, or because an engineer foresaw that something terrible could happen. The rule is followed until it becomes routine, and routine breeds familiarity. And familiarity breeds a quiet, incremental erosion of the exact caution that made the rule necessary in the first place. And then one night, on a drilling rig in the North Sea, someone opens a clamp. The families of Roy Lucas, Bjorn Javer Bergerson, Truls Hellevik, William Cramen, and Martin Saunders spent years navigating the legal aftermath of the disaster. The Norwegian investigation attributed the deaths to human error and inadequate procedural safeguards, but criminal charges were never filed. The company, Dolphin AS, paid compensation settlements to the families. The specific individuals involved were never prosecuted. Truls Hellevik's family pursued the case for decades, pushing for a fuller accounting of how the chain of command had failed, who bore responsibility for the confirmation step that wasn't taken, and why the system had been designed in a way that made this error possible at all. Their pursuit of those answers is one of the reasons the Byford Dolphin Incident remains active in safety research literature. Not as a closed case, but as an ongoing lesson. Because the thing about the Byford Dolphin, the thing that distinguishes it from other industrial disasters of the same era, is not the violence of what happened. Other accidents have killed more people. Other explosions have been more visually catastrophic. What makes this case different is the precision with which it illustrates the single most dangerous failure mode in any high-stakes human system. The assumption that the person next to you has already checked the thing that cannot go unchecked. Nobody on the Byford Dolphin that night was incompetent. Nobody was reckless in the way we typically imagine recklessness. They were experienced professionals operating in a demanding environment under time pressure, and at a specific moment, in a specific sequence, the handoff of a critical verification step fell into a gap between two people, and nobody caught it. That gap That's the thing. That's the thing that keeps systems engineers awake at night. Not the dramatic failures. Not the explosions and the fires. The gap. The moment where two competent people each assumed the other one had already done the thing that would have changed everything. The Byford Dolphin still operates, under different ownership, under significantly upgraded safety systems, in a regulatory environment transformed by the very disaster it survived. If you were to walk onto that rig today, you would find pressure interlock systems, redundant verification protocols, and a mandatory two-person confirmation requirement for every trunk operation that is enshrined not just in company policy, but in Norwegian maritime law. You would also find, if you knew where to look, a plaque. It doesn't say much. It names the five-man. It gives the date. It doesn't try to explain what happened, or why, or who's responsible. It just marks the place where 5 men went to work and didn't come home, and asks you to remember that the rules, the ones that seem excessive, the ones that slow you down, the ones that make experienced professionals roll their eyes, exist because someone, somewhere, already paid for them with their life. The North Sea is still out there, still 4 degrees, still indifferent, still producing oil and gas for a world that mostly doesn't think about the men who live inside pressurized steel chambers at the edge of the habitable world to bring it to the surface. Roy Lucas, Bjorn Javerbergersen, Charles Hellevick, William Cramen, Martin Saunders. Remember the rule they ignored. Because the only thing standing between a system working perfectly and 5 families receiving the worst phone call of their lives was that rule and the 30 seconds it would have taken to follow it.